Well, hello there and welcome back to The Plant Path. My name is Sajah Popham, and I just want to say thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy life to check out this episode here, where I'm going to be talking about the topical application of herbs. So when I say topical application of herbs, what's the number one thing that pretty much everyone is going to think about? Well, I would say a majority of the time, it's going to be thinking of putting herbs on your skin, right? It's going to be some way of applying an herb to the skin for whether it be wound, cuts, scrapes, contusions, injuries, broken bones, stiff, sore muscles, whatever it might be. More often than not, when we think of topical application of herbs, we think of putting it on the skin, which is not incorrect. But what I want to talk about here is I want to open up our understanding of topical application in a much broader sense, because technically the definition of topical application isn't putting it on the skin. The definition of topical application is, in regards to herbal medicine, herb coming into direct contact with the tissue that we want to treat. Okay. So anytime herb touches tissue that we want to treat, we would consider that a topical application. And I think that this is an important concept to consider because there's certain herbal actions that we tend to really only think in terms of something that applies to the skin when you put the herb on your skin, that totally kind of blows open the whole, really for me has revolutionized my understanding of some of those herbal actions, because we can have internal topical application of herbs as well. And this is really, really important for a number of reasons. One of which is that certain herbal actions only really happen when the herb comes into contact with the tissue. Other herbal actions, like there's certain qualities in herbs where that property doesn't happen systemically, it only happens topically. A really good example of this is, you open up any herb book these days and you're gonna see the word anti with some sort of pathogenic microorganism after it. Terms: antibacterial, antifungal, antimicrobial, anti-amoebic, anti-COVID, anti-influenza, antiviral, blah, blah, blah. Now, the thing is that a lot of the research on those, the only way that we could say an herb has that property is if it's traditionally used to treat infectious disease. That's obviously a pretty clear indicator. But more often than not, usually either the plant, the extract, or an isolate from the herb is tested in a petri dish, right? So in vitro with a certain pathogenic microorganism, and then they're just seeing does this herb or this extract or this constituent somehow neutralize, kill, disable, transform, whatever, that pathogen. If so, then they're gonna say, oh, this herb is antiviral, or antibacterial or whatever. Now, that's a whole other rant I could go on in regards to the myth of antiviral, especially. The whole antiviral property, I think, is a little bit sloppy in some ways. It just, there's a lot more specificity that needs to be gone into in terms of what does that actually mean, as it applies to that particular herb. But in many instances, when an herb is tested in that way, constituent comes into contact with, say, a virus in a petri dish, people extrapolate and say, oh, this herb's antiviral. So they start taking tinctures of it for a systemic influenza infection. And that doesn't work, right? Or an herb is tested against a very particular virus like HPV, herpetic lesions, works on that. That doesn't necessarily mean it'll work on some other kind of virus. So anyways, my point is that a lot of those anti-actions actually need to come into direct contact. The herb needs to come into direct contact with the infected tissue. So what I want to do is I want to explore the topical action in a little bit more depth with you today, share some of the preparations, the actions, the organ systems, the preparations, and am I going to talk about some herbs? Yeah, I'll mention some herbs as well. So first off, let's talk about the mucosa, because when we think of topical application of herbs, we usually think in terms of the skin, as I said. Now the mucosa, we can really think of as the inner skin, okay? So it is really just a continuation of the skin on the that's on the surface of the body, but internally. The mucosa, as a tissue, lines all of the organ systems that are exposed to the outside world. So we're thinking the gastrointestinal tract, the respiratory system, the urinary tract, the female reproductive system, and the male reproductive system. And honestly, male reproductive system really is just an attribute of the urinary tract. Female reproductive system is pretty distinct in that way. Simply because, male anatomy, everything's on the outside, female anatomy, everything's on the inside. So these organ systems all have an orifice that opens up to the outside world, whereby we can administer an herb, right? We can apply an herbal remedy into that orifice in order to have a topical effect on that tissue. I would say the main exception here is the urinary tract. For obvious reasons, right? I mean, we can put things up in our sinuses. We can put things in our mouth. We can put things in our ear. We can even, do enemas for action on the colon. It's not uncommon to insert things or do steams or boluses or things like that intravaginally for infections and things like that. We're usually not putting things up our urethras, right? Like that should make you cringe a little bit, right? As anybody does. So that's really the only, I would say, mucous membrane containing organ system where we don't really insert things. Okay. So I want to cover these different organ systems and talk about what kind of preparations we would use to apply herbs topically there, what actions are relevant, and some specific remedies that have just classically been used in that way. So let's start with the most obvious and talk about the skin. This is obviously the most obvious place to apply topicals. We're usually using herbs in this manner for open wounds, cuts, scrapes, splinters, lacerations, puncture wounds, right? Anytime the tissue is opened and you're bleeding, right? Oftentimes we're using herbs topically for venomous stings, bites, contact with irritants, poisons, like irritating plants. You get the nettle sting, or you get some poison oak or poison ivy, things like that. Trauma injuries, so broken bones, sprains, strains, contusions, muscle injuries, pain, right? We use herbs topically quite a bit for pain. That can be oftentimes muscle pain more often than not, but they can be used for deeper joint pain, headache pain. So these are not uncommon ways that we use herbs directly on the skin. Now, the primary actions that are the most relevant here, one is vulnerary for sure. So vulnerary means something that is going to be wound healing. Wound healing herbs oftentimes are astringent in nature. What we find, what's very common with a vulnerary herb, which means it will heal a wound, as we see oftentimes many common sub-actions there associated with that. So astringency being one, whereby the herb will tighten, bind, and contract the tissues. This is usually through the presence of tannins that will... Tannins are cool. They kind of knit proteins together in a way, is the way that we understand them. They knit proteins together, tighten and bind them. So that's what helps to bind a wound back together over time. Oftentimes they're inflammation modulating. Oftentimes they're styptic. So styptics will help stop bleeding. We've got some really great remedies that are super important first aid herbs for that. So the styptics will staunch bleeding. You also have, your basic antimicrobial type properties, antibacterial, antifungal, antiviral. Okay, so again, I'm not a huge fan of these terms all the time, but they are useful. So I think it's good to just use them with specificity. So you've got things like, viral herpes lesions, like cold sores. You've got bacterial infections that can occur on the skin. You've got fungal infections, tinea pedis, athlete's foot, jock itch, things like that, fungal infections. So those types of antimicrobial actions can be very useful to consider for use on the skin. Demulcents can be really good for dry skin conditions, in inflamed skin conditions to kind of cool and soothe inflammation on the skin. And then you have your rubefactants, which would be essentially circulatory stimulants, very localized circulatory stimulants to drive blood to a local area. Rubefactia, another term you'll see for that is counter-irritant, which is it's the same property, but it's basically flooding blood, dilating the capillary beds, kind of irritates the skin a little bit. Usually a counter-irritant will produce a bit of redness. Like the nettle rash, the nettle sting is counter-irritation, right? If you put a bunch of cayenne pepper or mustard on the skin, you got to be really careful with mustard because it can raise blisters, but especially like mustard powder specifically there. But that's counter-irritation or the rubefacient property. So these are the main actions that I tend to think of herbs, the actions of herbs that you would consider applying topically onto the skin. Now, we have some specific preparations here that I think is very good to get a hang of making these, right? So the first would be poultices. So a poultice basically is oftentimes the fresh herb, but you can do this with powders too, where you mix. If it's fresh herb, oftentimes you can just crush it, sometimes mixed with a little bit of flour, and sometimes a little water to make it a little more liquidy if need be. Sometimes, like if you're out in the field, you'll just pop it in your mouth, chew it up, and then slap it on that way. But it's basically just applying crushed, mushy plant material. Of course, classic one here is like the spit poultice of plantain for bee stings, splinters, all manner of first aid situations, cuts, scrapes, wounds, things like that. Very, very good. I've heard of, plantain's really awesome here. I've even heard of it preventing anaphylactic reactions in people from like bee stings, especially if you're doing a spit poultice, right? The benefit of the spit poultice is not only, you're getting your poultice applied, but you're generally also swallowing the juice of the plant, swallowing some of the plant, so you get some internal action there too. But the poultice, very, very good. Comfrey poultices, classically used for broken bones. I think there's whole ways that there's an art to creating really effective poultices, especially for pain, injury, muscles, broken bones, etc. There's a whole artistry to compounding, blending, and preparing really good, effective poultices. You also have fomentations or washes. So typically a wash obviously is just making an infusion or decoction of the herbal water extract of the herb and washing an afflicted area. That's typically used for infectious type situations. A fomentation, from my understanding, is basically a wash that where you're soaking cloth in that tea and wrapping or applying that medicated cloth to that local area. Then, of course, you've got your infused oils, which are a very common way herbs are applied topically, whereby you take the herb and you extract it in some sort of fixed oil, whether that be olive oil, avocado oil, castor oil, whatever it might be. Those infused oils are really great used as is. They oftentimes are made as bases for preparing creams or for preparing salves. The nice thing about a salve is basically an infused oil with beeswax melted into it to solidify it slightly. You don't want it too solid because then it's just messy to apply. You like getting your salve consistency down is, I think, key to a good quality salve. But the nice thing about a salve is just the ease of application. I think salves are one of the most convenient ways of delivering and applying herbs topically. One thing I will mention though about salves, side note here, is you have to be a bit careful in using salves on infectious skin situations, especially like bacterial infections like MRSA, because oftentimes those types of bacterial infections they thrive in an anaerobic environment. Well, what happens with salves is that the beeswax in the salve, if you put it on, put enough of it on, it's going to tend to create an anaerobic environment. So you have to be a bit careful actually with using salves for infectious skin situations. I would say specifically, really resistant type bacterial skin diseases, even maybe some fungal things. You just want to be careful that you don't create an anaerobic environment, because sometimes those skin infections can actually spread to how far you put the salve on, right? I heard Paul Bergner telling stories of that with cases of MRSA that would spread right to the border of where the salve was put on. So that's something to be aware of with salves. And then you have liniments. Now, a liniment is a much more of a liquid that's most conveniently is sprayed on. So you spray a liniment on. These are usually alcohol preparations. Now that can be alcohol like from a tincture. You can use tinctures as like basically if you put a tincture topically on the skin, it's a liniment. But some liniments are strictly for topical usage. And because of that, some of them are actually prepared with isopropyl alcohol. Obviously, you can't take that internally. What's common is that liniments are commonly used more for musculoskeletal issues on sore muscles, injuries, stiff joints. It's very common, in Eastern medicine. There's the ditajals, which are martial arts liniments. Different martial arts schools usually have their unique recipe of a ditajal, which are, liniments used for bruises, broken bones, sprains, strains, right? Martial artists commonly get hurt. I grew up doing martial arts starting from the age of 4 up till 18. So I did martial arts for a really long time, traditional Japanese martial art. And we had our specific recipe of ditajal that was unique to the dojo that I trained in. That was really worked very, very well. It was very, very aromatic. Definitely had some toxic plants in there. It was not for internal use. I remember there being some aconite in there and lots of other things. So anyways, some of the classic herbs here topically for the skin, probably not news to any of you that have been studying herbalism for a while, or even some of you that are maybe still new to herbalism. These are really common herbs, great herbs to start with, great herbs to get to know, great herbs to have around your house, your car, your first aid kit, take them hiking and backpacking, and when you're traveling, things like plantain, calendula, comfrey. These are I would say these are probably our 3 primary classic wound healing herbs for topical usage. The one thing I would note about comfrey for if using it for wounds is to not use comfrey on puncture wounds. It works so well at healing wounds. In a way, I always think of comfrey kind of heals top down. meaning it can heal the surface of the skin, but not the deeper puncture, and it can trap debris. It can prevent the wound from, being properly cleaned, right? And it can just create an environment more prone to infection. So be a little careful with comfrey for puncture wounds. Otherwise, any type of other wound that's not too deep is good. Yarrow is really great here. That's kind of a primary styptic that I prefer to use. I also like it in wound healing, salves, infused oils, things like that. Yarrow's great. Cayenne is very, very nice for stiff, sore muscles. Really love cayenne. I use it a lot. As someone that deals with chronic pain, I use a pretty good amount of topicals, and I think cayenne's one of the best for topical pain. Echinacea, key herb. Not a lot of people remember that echinacea is very good topically. Anytime there is some sort of topical infection, echinacea is very, very good. It's also really key for any type of bites, poisonous bites, venomous bites. Talking, copperhead, rattlesnake, brown recluse, black widow, those types of things. Echinacea topically and internally, really, really good. I also like arnica here for pain. Arnica salve's pretty classic there for injury, pain, inflammation, etc. Also, it's also worth mentioning, crystalline menthol, or even just or peppermint essential oil, very good. Topical anodyne, menthol, also camphor, very, very good there. So these are some of our pretty classic topical applications for the skin. Okay, next we have the respiratory tract. Now, this is important because we can deliver herbs topically to the respiratory tract. I like to separate here the difference between the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract. So upper respiratory tract, I tend to think of as, I find different people divide it a little differently. Some people think upper respiratory really is just like what's in the head. So nose, sinuses, and then down to here. And then once you get below that, you're in the lower respiratory tract. I kind of think of throat and up. So I tend to think of the throat as upper respiratory along with the sinuses. Because I think lower respiratory is like once you branch out into the bronchioles and down into the lungs, that's more lower respiratory. Now, upper respiratory, very easy to deliver herbs topically, right? I mean, literally anytime you swallow something, you're delivering herbs topically onto the throat, which is very, very good for those nasty throat infections, the tonsillitis, strep throat, things like that, swollen lymph nodes. And then we can also apply herbs topically to the sinuses in the form of sinus sprays, in the form of neti pots, in the form of infused oils. So these are really, really good methods for delivering herbs into the upper respiratory tract. The main actions that we typically are thinking of here would be astringents. Especially in the upper respiratory, astringents are hugely important. It's very common for those upper respiratory infections to cause a lot of leakiness of the mucosa, either dripping out or dripping in the back of the throat through like postnasal drip. You get a lot of swelling here, the tonsils, the adenoids, everything's just boggy and atonic. Astringents are very good in there. Decongestants. Many times astringents can be decongestants. Many times bitters, pungents can be decongestant. Here we have, again, the antimicrobial quality of antibacterial, antifungal properties, very good. And then expectorants. There are some expectorants that can be delivered topically. And I would say here, the main property of the herb would be aromatic herbs. Specifically, stimulant expectorants tend to be able to be delivered topically more for the lower respiratory tract. This is because they are highly aromatic and rich in volatile or essential oils. Now think of that. That is a topical action, right? When you're burning an herb and you're breathing in the smoke, that smoke is, say you're volatilizing some frankincense and myrrh resins and you're breathing in all of that resinous smoke and it's touching your lungs. That is a topical action. Say you're diffusing some eucalyptus essential oil. You breathe that in, it's touching your lungs. That's a topical action. Okay. So I think this was like really eye-opening for me of like, oh, that is topical, right? That's not, it's an internal usage, but we always think topical always means external, and that's actually not the case. So main preparations here would be inhalations. So that would be steams, diffusers, standing in a steamy shower, baths. Pretty much any time you're using hot water to volatilize an herb. So that could be boiling aromatic herbs in a tea, getting a really aromatic tea. Even if you're drinking a cup of peppermint tea and you're just breathing in that menthol and all those volatiles in the peppermint to open up your sinuses, that's a topical action, right? So, but you're typically using water. This can be either through making teas and breathing in the steam, or could be with volatile oils and diffusing volatile oils in a bath, in the shower, doing the little tent steaming situation. Or third would be fumigation, so burning of aromatic herbs, smudging, things like that. Now, you also have poultices, salves, and infused oils. These are usually what I would think of as very balsamic. Poultices, salves, or infused oils. So that could be, the classic one here is the mustard poultice. Very rich in aromatic oils. You definitely don't ever do straight mustard powder. You will burn yourself. Unless you've got like ultra thick, not sensitive skin in any way whatsoever. But most people, straight mustard powder will burn. So you always mix it with some sort of flour. Salves, these are usually very resinous, very aromatic. You think of Icy Hot, Vicks Vapor Rub, right? These more over-the-counter things. That's the premise of those. And it's very common for people to overlook topical treatment of infused oils or salves, very aromatic, vaporous salves for respiratory infections. But man, really, really good. They can be very good to deliver antimicrobial volatile oils to the respiratory tract. Many times they can help to open up, dilate, and relax. Many times they can actually penetrate in through the skin and deliver that way too. Help break up thick, stagnant mucus and expectorate that. Then you got things like your neti pot, simple salt water neti pot rinses for the sinuses. Oftentimes, if you tilt back and breathe a little, you can get it down your throat a little. That can be very good to just wash the local area. But you can medicate those neti pots, right? Rather than just using water, maybe you use an herbal tea or you drop some tinctures in there as well. Then you have also insufflation of infused oils. So that in Ayurvedic medicine is referred to as nasya. So where you apply medicated oils up into the nose and sinuses and kind of let it permeate down that back region. Or saline sprays. This is very common over-the-counter medication as well, but we can make our own with herbs that work really, really well through doing saline sprays. Sometimes you could put a little xylitol in there, which is actually pretty nice, and put some tinctures in there, small amounts of tinctures, a little bit of glycerin sometimes is very nice as well. Water, a little glycerin. Usually 2 ounces of water to say maybe a teaspoon of glycerin is more than enough. And then some drops of tinctures in there for, chronic sinusitis, things like that. These are the things we typically use them for. We're usually treating respiratory route infections here. sinusitis, rhinitis, throat infections, strep throat, tonsillitis, bronchitis, things of that nature. Hey, some good remedies that I like here in this category for the respiratory tract. Poplar buds. This is one we've used a lot here, both topically as salves. We've also used the tinctures, and actually, honestly, sometimes if you take a really, really aromatic tincture and put it in your mouth and then just breathe in, you'll get some topical effect that way too if it's a very aromatic herb. So poplar buds are really nice. Populus trichocarpa, those resinous buds that you can collect in the winter. They grow all along our rivers here in Northwest Washington, so I've used that medicine a lot. Eucalyptus, obviously, this is a classic in the form of essential oil for treating coughs. A lot of our aromatic mints are very good here. My two favorites would be thyme and oregano. Very good as teas, very good as volatile oils, very good in infused oils to create a very vaporous salve. Osha is very nice here. Classic herb used by the North American natives. Very good remedy. Richly aromatic, a little bit at risk ecologically, so maybe it's not the best to use, but I include it here because it's very rich in essential oil and is very nice. Now, one random one, but I want to mention it here, is tangerine essential oil. Tangerine essential, I don't use a lot of straight essential oils, but boy, tangerine peel volatile oils, very, very nice in your vaporous salves in order to clear out, kind of relax spasmodic coughs, actually is very nice. And then you've got your really kitchen remedies, mustard, like I mentioned earlier, onions, garlic, classic remedies here, those sulfur containing plants. Echinacea can be used here as well. Anytime we're talking infectious stuff, echinacea is good. Andrographis can be used there topically. Here we're talking more for insufflation up the nose. And there's a few other remedies that I like there that I'm actually going to cover in a whole separate video here to continue our theme of topical remedies. We're gonna zoom in a different video and talk about how to create medicated neti pots, which is something I recently had a really awesome, challenging but awesome personal experience with. So we'll talk about that in a separate video here on the channel. Okay, next system would be the digestive system. So this is very easy system again to overlook in consideration of a topical effect, right? Now remembering that, anytime you drink an herb, you swallow it, you're getting topical effect on the digestive system. You drink a big cup of tea. That tea is going through, it's touching your esophagus all the way down. It's in the stomach, your small intestines, getting down into the large intestine, which is typically where water is absorbed. So, you're getting a good amount of contact with tissue there through the digestive system. So these are consideration of topical effects for the GIs, very useful for infections of the GI, obviously, dry constipation, to get the mucosal membrane secreting more, healing of wounds in the GI, staunching bleeding, alleviating gastric pain, ulceration, whether that be gastric ulceration or intestinal ulceration, leaky gut syndrome. This is a big one, right? A lot of people have impaired intestinal epithelial membrane function. That can be very useful. Inflammation, just inflammation of the intestinal wall. Diarrhea, right? Getting those tonic astringent herbs in there to slow down diarrhea. It's a topical effect. Really, really good there. So some of the main actions that I think of here in the gut would be vulnerary. And this was a mind blower for me. This is something I learned from Paul Bergner, when he described using a vulnerary to heal the gut lining. I was like, it was amazing. Like total game-changing concept for me that really helped me help a lot of people. That one concept, vulnerary in the gut. Like that concept alone has really helped a lot of people out. So just like tipping my invisible hat there to Paul Bergner. Thank you, Paul, for everything that you do if you ever hear this. So vulneraries, right? Again, just like we use them on the skin to heal wounds on the skin, we use them to heal wounds, literal wounds in the gut. So there we think gastric ulcers, intestinal ulcers, but then leaky gut syndrome. This is a huge one here. As mentioned on the skin, vulneraries tend to modulate inflammation to an extent. Oftentimes they tend to be astringent in nature. All our astringents for the gut are worthy of consideration here for topical use. The demulcents, of course, very, very good here. Now, the weird thing about demulcents, like especially the really mucilaginous ones, is that, you drink a really slimy, slippery, thick marshmallow infusion. None of that crosses the gut wall. If those polysaccharides got in your bloodstream, that'd be really bad news, because they're just really large compounds. It'd be bad. So none of them cross the gut wall, but yet they still moisten the lungs. They still moisten the urinary tract. You can take them internally and they still moisten the female reproductive system. So there's some sort of reflex that occurs. Something in the digestive system is triggered, I think, that causes those mucosa systemically to increase secretions. But since you're swallowing them, those demulcents do come into direct contact with the gut mucosa. And this is why I think most of the demulcents, or all of the demulcents, definitely impact the gut, whereas some might do the urinary tract a little more so than others. Some might do respiratory tract more so than others, etc. Antimicrobials again, so antibacterial, antifungal. This is also where we see our anti-amoebic or anti-parasitic or anthelmintic. I think those are a bunch of different ways of saying the same thing. Apply. So a lot of those remedies, right? Your black walnut, your wormwood, your clove, all of those herbs that neem, the long pepper, Piper nigrum. All these herbs are very, very good. You want them to come into contact with those digestive tissues. I think taking them in tinctures will work, but I think drinking them works better. Although they're really tough to get down. Styptic, so any sort of gut bleeding. This can happen with ulcers. Obviously, if someone's really bleeding out, like they need to go to the hospital. But sometimes a little bit of blood in the stool. Maybe it's an internal hemorrhoid. Maybe IB, inflammatory bowel disease. Sometimes there can be, diverticulitis, Crohn's, right? This is where styptics can be helpful. Inflammation modulating properties, very helpful. So the main preparations that we think of here, powders, basically you want to think in terms of surface area. So if you're thinking, okay, we've got systemic inflammation in the gut, if you're the whole GI, okay, we want the herbs to come into contact with the tissue. That's a lot of tissue to come into contact with. So think of, taking even 5 mils, which is generally to most a pretty good sized dose of tincture. Pour 5 mils of tincture out on a table and see how much surface area it covers. Pour 8 to 12 ounces of tea on a table and see how much surface area it covers, right? So this is why I think infusions, decoctions, or enough powders mixed with 8 to 12 ounces of water are really the best ways to administer herbs topically to the gastrointestinal tract. Now, of course, some do things like enemas, oil enemas. Some people do tea enemas for topical action on the colon. That's a possibility. I personally don't do that. And I haven't really recommended them that much. Maybe that's because I'm not as educated on them as others. But if I was to, I would really probably lean more towards the Ayurvedic approach to doing those. And then, one other thing to consider is that oftentimes a lot of those alcohol tinctures are absorbed in the mucosa, the buccal mucous membranes in the mouth, the mucosal membranes in the stomach. It's very common, tinctures aren't really going to get that far down into your digestive system. They're really absorbed pretty quickly. So if you want to get stuff down into the colon, for example, I think drinking decoctions or infusions or taking powders mixed in water is the way to go. Then, of course, you can have some, topical applications for the lower opening into the GI tract, right, or around the anus for things like hemorrhoids, or if people get, itchy bum and they, put some, powdered calendula mixed with some like tapioca flour or something to, alleviate some itchiness, or maybe there's a little, sometimes like jock itch the tinea can spread sometimes to around the opening of the anus. Of course, applying witch hazel extract or astringent salves. Sitz baths actually is another really good topical application down there. Sitz baths, both, we see that for the anus, but also for, vaginal type complaints. So great remedies here in the GI are vulneraries, right? So the big three here: calendula, plantain, yarrow. Those are my faves. Yarrow and shepherd's purse, of course, are going to be our top notch. Styptics for the digestive system. Marshmallow is my go-to demulcent for the GI. Slippery elm is very, very good here too, but it's a bit ecologically threatened, so I try to use marshmallow. The only time I would use slippery elm is if someone is like really, really weak, really deficient, emaciated, dry, and just kind of malnourished. If I want to give them like a little extra nutrition, that's where I might think slippery elm. Go-to cola. This was a newer one for me. I learned from David Winston. That makes a lot of sense, right? It's nice. It's moistening. It cools heat, inflammation, irritation. Very good inflammation modulating herb for inflamed tissue. It's vulnerary, wound healing. Also, really, it's a nervine too. So I always like it for people that sometimes have some digestive issues and they're a little nervous. Witch hazel, great one there too, as an astringent. Topically, applied topically, but also taken internally. Obviously not witch hazel extract, but it's good astringent. And then a lot of the astringents are oftentimes indicated for like ulcerations. That's where you see things like oak bark, and even people have used comfrey internally in that way. Meadowsweet is another one there. Okay, so female reproductive system. These are most commonly used for infection of the female reproductive system. So things like candidiasis, trichomonas, bacterial vaginosis, etc. They can also be used in some instances of cervical dysplasia. Some people use some herbs in this way for fibroids and other female reproductive imbalances, but more often than not, we're talking using these for more infectious situations of the female reproductive system, HPV and whatnot. Antimicrobial being obviously a pretty key property here. Antifungal, antibacterial, I would say would be predominantly important, but antiviral could be applicable there if we're talking about any sort of herpes simplex lesions. Vulnerary, wound healing, astringent. Astringent can be good, especially if there's any sort of discharge occurring there. The main preparations that we use here in the female reproductive system would be like a vaginal douche. So sometimes the way that those are done is that they're applied to like one of those cups. They're placed in those cups and then inserted and left overnight and then removed in the morning. Suppositories and boluses. A suppository or bolus is almost like it's basically a salve. You just prepare a salve, but you would pour it into a mold that's like bullet shaped. That just makes it a little bit easier to insert. Good remedies here. Golden seal is fantastic. I think there's arguments to be made that really any of the berberine containing herbs would be applicable here because berberine is just such a great, relatively broad spectrum or not berberine, but the herbs that contain berberine tend to be pretty good broad spectrum antibacterials, antifungals, things like that. And I would say golden seal also applies definitely to the respiratory tract as well there, and the digestive system for that matter. Once again, calendula, plantain. These are two really good topical herbs for pretty much universally. Yarrow again as well, especially if there's any bleeding. Echinacea, very, very good. I would say echinacea is pretty important there. One combo, echinacea is very commonly combined with wild indigo, which is Baptisia tinctoria. It's a very strong combination. Baptisia, of course, is a low dose herb. It's very strong, but it has been used topically to treat things like HPV infection in the female reproductive system. So, which can cause cervical dysplasia and things like that. Usnea is also another herb that is good to consider for that. Then now, lastly, for topicals, you have things like eyes. Now, a lot of the things I've mentioned, eyes can be used. You've got, again, calendula, plantain, astringent things. The main thing with eyes is you got to make sure you filter the herbs out really, really well. Typically, you're only going to use water extracts, so teas. Chamomile, very, very good. A really simple folk remedy is to just soak a chamomile tea bag in water till it's nice and hydrated and put that on. It's like an instant poultice, works very well. Black tea, very, very good for the eyes as well. So you've got things like pink eye or conjunctivitis, scratches to the eyeball, which I've had happen actually like 3 or 4 times, which is very, very painful. Getting a scratch on your eye hurts really, really bad. So don't do those things. Protect your eyes. But some blepharitis, conjunctivitis, a lot of those same herbs. Golden seal, again, too, very good there for those eye infections. Similar for the ears. You've got typically infused oils being used, and typically being used for infections, right? Otitis media. Garlic is the classic remedy there, garlic infused oil. I've heard some people use propolis too. And then usnea I've heard being used there as well. But garlic really is just use garlic. It works. It's like right there. Everybody has it usually. If not, it's right down the road at your grocery store. Garlic infused oil, very, very good. And then usually you like to combine a little St. John's wort in there. That's mainly for the pain that goes along with an ear infection. It's just the St. John's wort is there to cool and calm the nerve pain that usually is going along with that ear infection. So there's some other just kind of rounding it out there with our with some other topical applications. So that is a redefinition of topical application of herbs. Thank you very much for joining me here for this exploration of topical application. I just want to close with a quick little side note here, though, on essential oils. I don't personally use a lot of essential oils. If I do, I definitely do not typically use them neat, meaning apply them directly onto the skin. There are 2 exceptions. I would say lavender and eucalyptus, not eucalyptus, lavender and tea tree are commonly, to many gentle enough to be used neat or directly on the skin. Most other essential oils usually should be diluted with the carrier oil. Sometimes that can be as simple as just put a little puddle of carrier oil in your hand, put your drop or 2 of essential oil and rub that on, and you can do your thing like that. I never recommend taking pure essential oils internally. I have a little bit of a soapbox discussion on that. I won't get into it now because this video has gone pretty long, but I just want to mention that I don't encourage you to take those internally, unlike many very popular companies recommend. So anyways, thank you very, very much for your time and for your attention. I do really appreciate it. If you're watching this or listening to this anywhere other than my website, head on over to evolutionaryherbalism.com. They've got tons of free material over there for you to check out. If you are not currently subscribing to YouTube or the podcast, hit that subscribe button. Be sure to like this video wherever you're at. Like, subscribe, all that good stuff. It really does help support the channel and enable me and my team to continue to publish quality free herbal education to you. So thank you very much. Blessings to your plant path. And until the next one, take care and be well.